Hey everybody, welcome to the 10% True podcast. Quick message from me before you get stuck in. This podcast is free, so there's no advertising. I don't monetize it on YouTube. You don't have to sit through any annoying adverts, and I don't even ask for any money through Patreon. But if you could, in exchange for that, drop me a like, leave a comment, share my content, and if you're listening to the podcast version, maybe leave a review of the channel. That would be hugely appreciated. It will help me to grow my audience, which is really what I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, with that, I'll let you get back to listening. Enjoy. Denny, welcome back to 10% True. It's great to have you on the channel again.
Steve, welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me again. I am surprised, I hope I've helped your readership and your viewers as they listen to me drone on. But the 104 is an exciting aircraft for me to talk about. I've had some absolutely wonderful experiences flying in the airplane, met terrific people.
This is something to look forward to then. So just for everybody's understanding, if you are tuning in, there are 3 previous episodes with Denny, as Denny's already referenced. If you haven't caught up on those, watch those first because we're kind of doing things in chronological order. And I should be honest and say we did actually talk about F-104 before, didn't we? But I didn't publish it because I think there was a sense that we rushed it a little bit. So what we're doing here, because we care about the quality of the podcast, and Denny cares about telling the story in the way that he's happy with, is we're re-recording, and which means it should be flawless. And I can see, Denny, you've brought some props along too, which you're presumably going to use during the course of this conversation. So Denny, you, if I remember correctly, because it's been a couple of weeks since we talked, you got to the F-104 by going to Luke and becoming part of the fighter weapons school for the F-104. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. I had just finished flying the F-105 at McConnell Air Base in Kansas, and the Air Force had made a decision to essentially transfer those aircraft to the National Guard and to the Air Force Reserve. And I was lucky enough to be able to fly the F-104 at Luke. And I began that in July of 1972 at Luke. And that was my last flight in the F-105. And the first several sorties that I flew at Luke, about 70 of them, was learning how their technique of teaching people to become instructor pilots in the aircraft at Luke Air Force Base. And my initial job after I got checked out as an instructor in the F-104 was training, not all, but mostly German young pilots that had just finished their undergraduate pilot training program in the T-37 and T-38. And we were introducing them at Luke Air Force Base into the F-104. First checking them out in the airplane, making sure they could fly, but then began the whole process of teaching them the entire syllabus of how the F-104 was being used. And that included basic flying, of course, but then air-to-air, where we're teaching them basic fighter maneuvers, advanced combat tactics, and how to actually first fly the aircraft, but then learning how to fight with it at Luke. But we also taught them being able to navigate low level in the F-104 for air-to-ground delivery with conventional weapons, but also with nuclear weapons. And so we taught them the full range of all of the things that they could be called upon by the German Air Force once they got assigned back home in Germany.
So if we unpack that a little bit then, when we talk about fighter weapons school today, we sort of think of that PhD level Nellis-based 6-month program or year-long program. I can't remember how long it is, where you end up a real master of your trade, and you go there having already been a forward ship flight lead and have some experience. So this sort of fighter weapons school was a sort of combined learn to fly the airplane, learn to employ the airplane, and then go back to your unit type thing, rather than graduate as a PhD level student in the airplane.
Actually, there were two different programs that we're talking about here. The fighter weapons school was a separate unit, and we had two courses there. We had a long course that essentially was this PhD level course that you're talking about. But this was for people who were already weapons instructors in their own squadrons back in Germany, and they would be assigned to Luke. We had Canadians on board. We had folks from Holland were there, and so. But that was kind of a different unit. The first part that I was involved in was basically teaching second lieutenants that were essentially first flying the aircraft. That was their first assignment out of pilot training, and I did that for about a year and a half. And then got picked to go through the fighter weapons school course itself, and then they chose me to lead it. And so I wound up leading this group of folk, and that came probably halfway through my tour at Luke Air Force Base, and. It was interesting. The aircraft, all the aircraft were painted with U.S. markings, but they were actually owned by the German government.
Okay. And
my salary was paid for by the Germans to the U.S. It was kind of an interesting arrangement.
What was the airplane like then? From a so if we deal with the first part first, so you're a German pilot who's just graduated from flying the T-38. What was the transition like from the T-38 to the F-104 for those students of yours then?
I don't think I didn't see any trouble at all with those people. The T-38 was a wonderful aircraft to be able to teach people how to fly a Century Series aircraft. The T-38 accelerated very fast and ground. It handled well. It rolled the rolling rate on T-38 is phenomenal. If you don't watch yourself and you put that stick full to the left or to the right, you're going to bang your head on a cockpit. It's just, it'll really, very responsive. The F-104, there were some aspects of that because of the high T-tail here that you can get yourself in some trouble if you don't pay attention to what you're doing. And but the people had, in terms of being able to take off and land the aircraft, I don't remember any problem with any of the students that were coming out of the UPT to be able to step into that machine and fly it.
Were those problems then, in terms of the high T-tail, were they similar to the ones that you had talked about? I think you talked about with the Voodoo. Airflow blanking or something similar to that. What was the issue then with the high T-tail for the F-104?
It's true for any aircraft with a high tail like that. And if you get the angle of attack up high enough, you're going to get a downwash on the tail, and it'll push the nose way up. They call that a pitch up. And so there were vanes that were added to the sides of the fuselage. I'll grab my S model. There were vanes that were added to the sides of the fuselage in here on either side that would measure the angle of attack that the aircraft had, but at the same, or the rate of movement. Oh, there goes my canopy. And so, in any event, there were mechanical devices that were added to the machine to help alleviate that issue and warn you that you're about to get into an area that the aircraft is going to do things on its own. And And that was something that I specifically taught, especially to all my students, but more in a fire weapons school because they're more often more apt to get into some of these higher maneuvering areas with lower speed that put you into an area of a problem. The F-101 had the same problem. There were a lot of F-101 pilots that actually died learning about this phenomenon called pitch-up. But once you understood how this behaved back here with this angle of attack, the aircraft itself, if you maneuvered it and paid attention to what the nose was doing on you, it turned out to be basically a non-issue.
What was the, and I know it's been a long time, so you might not remember the figures, but what sort of performance limits did it have? How fast could it go? How high could you get it? Where was it designed to operate as well? So obviously nuclear emission, there's a low level component to that.
Well, actually, the very first F-104, the A models, were all designed as air-to-air interceptors. They were designed by Kelly Johnson to be able to take off, and it would be loaded with AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, and it had a radar on it that was to be able to go out and find a Russian bomber and shoot it down. So it was an air defense interceptor initially. Later, as the availability of the aircraft became fairly known, they strengthened the wings and added hardpoints for air-to-ground weaponry that could be loaded on the aircraft. That became the C model. I never flew either of these aircraft. Matter of fact, the C models, they flew those. They sent a bunch of them over to South Vietnam, and they were used as air-to-air fighters, escort for the people going up into North Vietnam. And but there were, by the time I got to Vietnam in the F-105, the F-104s are gone. They had already been pulled back. But the German Air Force, as it was being reconfigured, was looking for an aircraft to replace the F-84. After the German Air Force was reconstituted, and they went through this a fair search, and there was a bit of a discussion going on within the German Air Force of what kind of aircraft that they were looking for, and the senior leadership within the Luftwaffe realized that what they were actually looking for, and the mission that they were going to be assigned, was an air-to-ground mission, not an air-to-air day fighter. And it turns out the F-104 is absolutely perfectly suited to be an aircraft that could be loaded with a nuclear weapon, that could fly very fast at very long range at low level, for this nuclear strike delivery capability that they were looking for. And that's where the F-104G model came in. And you can recognize the G model because it has a single stray down here, right at the bottom. There's only one. Right there.
Yeah.
And it's fairly long, and it's for increased stability at higher speeds, at high Mach numbers. That's the purpose of this thing. And this is showing let's get this thing turned here. Oh, yeah. You can see my nuke that's loaded on here.
Is that a B-61?
That's a B-61, and it's configured in a typical strike package that you would have seen if you were as I did later on, go to the strike squadrons and to evaluate them. So this is how it was loaded or created. And if you look at the airplane, there's not much drag. There's the front area is pretty low, and this thing will go and it's very, very stable at high speeds, even at low level. It was perfect. The S model you can recognize because it has 2 additional ventral strakes, ventral fins added on the outside. Again, these are added for at the higher speeds, and the S model stands for Sparrow, and they added the 2 additional hard points and so it had a total of 9. So the air defense guys they took the gun out of the S model for the air defense guys. The air to ground guys or the nuke guys retained the gun, and the aircraft could carry 2 Sparrow missiles plus either 4 or 6, depending upon what pylons that they decided to load those on with sidewinders. So as an air defense, they kept that in the inventory in Italy for quite some time.
With the Italians, we'll get back to flying the airplane in a minute, but you've mentioned the S model, so let's talk about it. But were the Italians the only operators to use the S model?
Oh no, the Turks had them as well.
Okay.
I think the Italians had the preponderance of them, but I think there was roughly 60 of them went to Turkey.
To Turkey as well. How good was it? And one of the things that I immediately think of is detection range for a radar, or power output for a radar is proportional to the size of the diameter of the radar antenna. You've very amply demonstrated there that it's a pencil-thin design. So how far could that radar see out to support a Sparrow missile in flight? I mean, were you getting the same sort of engagement ranges from an F-104S as you would do something else carrying a Sparrow? Any other fighter design? I mean, I was thinking F-16, the ADF versions, the F-15, the F-18, but that's slightly unfair because they had more advanced radars. But in terms of detection ranges, was there a similar capability between those airplanes?
Actually, they wound up with a different radar. The G model radar, or the G model, was not designed to fire a Sparrow. You could only fire sidewinders with a G model, and the radar sweep in the G model. If you looked at the radar scope itself, you got the ground scope. The sweep was like this. In the S model, you could hit a switch, and they had a better radar, and it was designed for actually for the Sparrow itself. So you could fire a radar missile as compared to only a heat seeker. And on your brown scope, instead of having the sweep going like this, with the S model, you could switch it so it would go back and forth with what we call a B-scan, which we had in Air Defense Command. The people in the F-106 and the F-102, the sweep was like that. And the beauty part of that is if you're getting in close on this type of a sweep and down here, you're gonna be down where there's a lot of clutter. And it is very difficult to tell what direction the blip is. On a B scope, as you get down in range, and here's the center, when you get down over here, you can tell he's right over there. You get a lot clearer picture.
So was it an effective solution in the F-104S? Could you, because so you've got with the Sparrow, you have to continue illuminating the target with the radar from the aeroplane, because the Sparrow is going to home in on the radar reflections from that transmission. You've got two missiles, presumably not massive range in terms of being able to target something. Was it an effective solution as a sort of carrier of the Sparrow then? Was it good for its time? Was it good by other standards? Was it impressive or not?
Well, I actually, to be fair, I never actually flew with the air-to-air guys, and that was a different squadron at Rimini. That was 2-3 squadron, and I was flying in 102 Stormo, which was or Grupo, which is the air-to-ground guys. This is a squadron I flew in.
Okay.
and with the S model, but to answer your question directly, I think that 104 for the defense role that was well suited for that. It could carry it had pretty decent range. The S model, the range was around, I think, almost 800 miles. So I mean, it's.
Where was all the fuel carried?
Where was it?
Yeah, external tanks mostly.
External fuel tanks plus internal fuel.
And where was the internal fuel then? I mean, it doesn't look like there's space to carry any. Because the wings are razor thin, so there were no wing tanks.
Oh, it was the fuel was carried up and in fuel tanks right along the fuselage and on top.
And that would give you 800 miles. So, but what was the range then if you weren't carrying those tanks? I mean, let's say you had to combat jettison. I'm asking you a question. I'm asking you about parametrics that are probably dim and distant in your memory. But if you had to combat jettison those fuel tanks, how much internal fuel range did you get?
There was a little bit of a difference between a two-seater and a single-seater. A two-seater on the G model, the internal fuel was, I think it was 5,200 pounds. And the two-seater, the F model, TF model, I think you went down to 4,800 because they used up some of the space for a gas tank for the second seat. And that would, if you're taking off in a clean aircraft with only internal fuel and going on a Mach 2 run, as we did at Luke Air Force Base, every one of these airplanes pulling out the line and cleaning tanks off, and on a two-seater, we stuff a pilot in the front seat, and I'd climb in the back seat, and off we would go. It'd be a fairly short mission. You take off and climb up at a fairly steep angle, run out, get up to 35,000 feet, shove the throttle up, go in an afterburner, and it'll run a Mach 2. And when I got, and the fuel controller in the J79 engine on this machine was rather interesting, because once you get to Mach 2, you can actually push it past Mach 2 to about 2.2. And eventually you're going to get this, what's called a slow light, because the temperature is leading edge temperature and the canopy pressures and so on. The designer is saying, slow this thing down. So you come out of afterburner and pull the nose up. And I've been up to 55,000 feet in that thing with a student, and then slowly roll over and point the nose right straight back at Luke Air Force Base and come back and land maybe 34 minutes.
Wow. How do you do that then in terms of the navigation? Did you have like a direction finder? Were you using TACAN or something like that? Because at Mark II, I don't know, I'm not going to try and do the maths in public. You're traveling lots of miles every minute, and presumably you can't see at 55,000 feet. You can't see Luke, or maybe it's a little speck. But how would you actually know where to go?
We used TACAN, but it also had a Doppler navigation system, and so you dial up your home plate, and the needle would point to it and tell you how far away it is. We were principally using TACAN.
Okay. You said that you were teaching the German students then, if we go back to the sort of the initial role that you had, so you were teaching the German students how to fly and fight the aeroplane. What strengths and weaknesses did it have in that area then? So obviously it was fast. You had range. Was it maneuverable? Was it something that you would probably want not to get into a dogfight with? What was your opinion of it?
Well, in terms of its role in air to ground, it was almost identical in my mind to flying the F-105, but it was the handling control qualities of the aircraft were excellent. The roll rate was just absolutely flying. And in terms of this maneuverability to be able to get weapons underground, it was certainly suitable. There's no doubt about that.
And was it something that, so were you flying against, I don't know, F-84s, F-86s, other Century Series fighters? Did those German students get exposure to dissimilar types during?
No, not with us. They may have back in Germany once, but at Luke, we were the air-to-air fighting we were teaching them was first these basic maneuvers of how you fly an aircraft, teaching these things called a high speed or a low speed yo-yo, where you're attacking an aircraft, and if you need a little bit of extra energy, you can pull to the inside of the turn and then come back up. That's a low speed yo-yo. High speed yo-yo is you're coming in really fast, and you want to get out of higher up to slow things down so you can get your nose on the, so we were teaching those sort of things, but it was all F-104 against F-104.
What were the common mistakes that you would see out of students then? What sort of things did they, I mean, you said that they didn't struggle to transition, administratively, let's say, the administrative phases of flight from a T-38 to an F-104, but what did they struggle with tactically?
I think well, it depends on whether in air-to-air, it's learning the process of being able to maneuver the aircraft around and being able to feel what the airplane is telling you. Because at the same time, developing a sight picture of what it is that you're looking for, and essentially the same thing for air to ground. It's just a learning process. It's not that much trying to teach someone how to play golf. How you hold your body and how you swing at this ball is all a learned process. You can talk about it all day long, but you actually have to do it in order to be able to learn it. And then while they're in the process of doing this, I try not to be too chatty in the cockpit, blowing in his ear, but at the same time instructing him, put the nose down a little bit more, pull it a little bit tighter. Okay, so this is the sight picture you're looking for. If you get yourself in this other one, now you got to do this other thing. And so it was basically helping them develop a feel for what it was that they were about.
I might be sort of exposing my limited geography knowledge here, but I think Luke's in Arizona, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. Right outside. It's just a little bit west of Phoenix.
So obviously from a German Air Force point of view, European weather notoriously bad. You would have known that, and of course they would have had to sort of live with that. How did the training from a weather point of view work then? Because if you're teaching them low-level navigation, it's one thing to do it over Texas, where presumably it's sunny most of the time, pretty good weather most of the time, and another thing altogether to come back to Europe and then try and do that in weather. What did you do to prepare them for that, or was there a separate program that they would then go through when they got back to Germany to expose them to that particular hazard?
Yes, it was. The reason why the Germans had them being trained in Germany or in Arizona in the first place is because of that fine weather, terrific access to gunnery ranges, air-to-air ranges, and so on. And you could build a predictable pattern and a predictable time of accomplishing all of these training sorties and these syllabuses. But once they graduated from our program at Luke, they went to Air Base in Jever in northern Germany to become acclimated to the poorer weather conditions that exist in Europe.
We'll get into, because obviously you end up going to Europe. We'll get into that in a bit then. But can we just talk a little bit about then your move after sort of 18 months or so to the fighter weapons school, going through first as a student and then becoming the commander of that. Again, I'm showing my ignorance, but I suppose that's the point of these conversations, isn't it? That you're learning. But when did the fighter weapons school concept start, and where did the F-104 program sit in within that? Again, today we're used to seeing fighter weapons school principally being based out at Nellis in Nevada, and they're all together. The different schools are all together, so I guess they can sort of pool resources and share knowledge and that kind of stuff. But where did the F-104 weapons school come from, and where does it sort of sit in the history of the weapons school as a whole?
It basically started. I'm not sure about the history of the development of the F-104 fighter weapons school, but it was a German Air Force, U.S. Air Force fighter weapons school. And so as the F-104 was developed, I'm sure it's probably about the time when after a year or two, the leadership at that time decided to form it, but it was formed at Luke. I don't know that there was a F-104 fighter weapons school at Nellis. Okay. There may have been, but this part I'm ignorant about. I don't know. But ours was at Luke, and we had our own unique fighter weapons school patch that very similar to the design of the one up at Nellis, but we certainly did not. We wanted to keep some of the attributes that they had, but we had our own that was that the guys proudly wore. And in terms of its capability of what we taught the core syllabuses that we developed at Luke were in the fighter weapons school were no different than what we're teaching in the F-4 or F-111 fighter weapons schools up at Nellis.
You've already given an example of that. You talked about the pitch up and the fact that if you were experienced, you were more likely to get into that regime and experience that. Well, what sort of other things were, or what sort of other things was the fighter weapons school teaching guys about? Did you do a lot of electronic warfare type stuff? Was it all about tactics? What other elements were there to the syllabus?
Yeah, we, as a matter of fact, there was a couple of things that we did. There were some, we taught the entire spectrum of the use of the aircraft by the weapons instructors back in Germany. So we had courses that refinements and nuclear weapons delivery procedures and tactics. We had a fair amount in air to ground with conventional weapons, whether dive bomb shooting rockets. We would experiment with different tactics from people coming in at different angles and timing to create confusion on the ground and maybe create some timing issues for the people on the ground. And so we spent a fair amount of time with that. We also spent a lot of time in the air-to-air change. Because as you know, the F-104 has a very high wing-loaded aircraft. And it's really not a dogfighter at all. But that doesn't mean you can't fight with it. And what we learned how to do is to create tactics where instead of attacking an aircraft and trying to come in at the tail end, we were teaching tactics where we would come down like this, high, and strafing our target and then busting right on through. And if the aircraft turned and saw us, we could just run out. I could get this airplane from cruise at 19,000 feet to VMAX on a deck over 800 knots in 19 seconds. I mean, it would move. And you know, so if they came down, we're gone. We're going to outrun anything they got loaded on that airplane. There's just no way they're going to hit us. And so we were teaching these tactics. And if the aircraft continued its turn, we were already really fast. We had a lot of energy on the aircraft, come back up into the fight. And we taught with a particular maneuver called a butterfly. And it was a maneuver that took advantage of the tactics that you could develop with the F-102, F-104. A lot of our flights were, instead of flying wing where you're like this, we were flying abreast and self-supporting each other, as well as being able to take advantage of the speed and power of the F-104.
So if you're coming downhill on them, the obvious question then is, what sort of performance did the radar have against ground clutter? How far out could you pick up a fighter-sized target that was lower than you?
You mean for air to air, or
yeah, for air to air? So if you're going to bounce a couple of fighters over here, you're going to come in from up high.
Yeah, we weren't working radar missiles. We were at that time we were basically would be loaded with Sidewinder.
But you weren't using your onboard radar to find these guys. You were using GCI or just visual?
Initially, you could sweep and see them, but again, in the fighter weapons school, we had G models, and so we had this A-scan scope, and if they were out far enough, you could see them. But we eventually got to the point where we're pretty much looking for it visually.
So am I right in thinking then, or inferring then, that radar was principally a ground mapping radar, or so that's the utility of the radar. It's for navigating when you were low to the ground, rather than really using it to find bad guys in the air.
Yeah, exactly right. It was really designed for searching the ground, looking for radar, your navigation path.
So did you, on the air-to-air side of things then, did you have visiting units from across the US who would come and give you exposure to different platforms? You've said that you're not a dogfighter, you're going to do these slashing attacks, so you don't want to get into a turning fight. So did you try to get into a turning fight to show them the futility of trying to do that, or were all your flights against other F-104s?
Well, as it turns out, that I had a friend of mine, Earl Henderson, that was the commander of the Aggressor Squadron up in Nellis when I was leading the F-104 Fighter Weapons School, and I called up Earl one day and I said, "Hey, Earl, are you interested in coming down to fight us?" And he jumped at the chance, came down. And so, yeah, he came down with his T-38s, and we did fly against them. They were shocked to find out the first air-to-air engagements. We took a lot of pictures of T-38s coming right straight down, looking at the cockpit and right through the pipe. And they were used to turning around, trying to look backwards and seeing somebody coming up their tailpipe. That wasn't where we were.
So how did you orchestrate that then? So if you're not using your onboard radar, you're not sort of building a picture from 20, 30 miles out. Are you using GCI to position you and talk your eyes onto these guys? What was the?
No, we didn't use GCI at all. It was we did try to figure out where they were by taking a peek at the radar, but we were really aiming at, and we would use that to be able to position ourselves in altitude-wise and diagonal, whatever the geometry wanted to be able to engage the battle. But we were working with our eyes and with the of course this attack we're going after them with the gun. And this wonderful Vulcan cannon in there that 100 rounds a second.
You obviously are not using a heads-up display in the format that is common today, where you've got a funnel that tells you where the rounds are going to fall and so on. So you had a lead computing optical sight, something not a million miles away from what they were flying in Mustangs in World War II.
Yeah,
right?
it did have a lead computing gun sight in it, and the work. Well, one of the things I taught specifically in this F-104 is that we're going back to this word called pitch up. And I knew we're dealing with people that are weapons instructors in their own fighter squadrons. And so their task at home was to be able to help teach their pilots, their line pilots, how to use an airplane. Some of the guys were kind of nervous of getting an airplane really slow. And so one of the techniques that I used, and I taught my own fighter pilots to use this, was to put the student in a position, the weapons instructor, they're in the front seat, I'm in the back seat, and get the airplane going and then point it straight up. And to let it run out of airspeed, and then tell them to lock the stick, don't touch the throttle, keep your feet off the rudders, and just let the airplane go up, and watch the airspeed come right down to zero. And I tell them, you're going to hear a lot of heavy breathing from your students when they do this. But the nose is going to fall down and the pointy end is going to go straight down. And then you just take your time and recover from the dive. And, I put them in a place where it was an extraordinarily uncomfortable position to be, but taught them how to work your way through having been put into the position. What do you do? And so I helped them. And so whether or not you happen to be slightly like this or like that, it was, you just lock the control. Don't touch nothing and let it fall.
Did the airplane have any other sort of foibles like that then? Were there any other parts of the envelope that people were a little bit fearful about?
Yeah, especially coming back in the landing, because once you get the gear down, the pusher is not going to work. It would work if you're with the wheels up, but if they're down, that aspect is taken away from you. And the reason for that is that if you're turning base to final and you're running a little bit on the slow side, and the airplane decides that it's going to give you a kicker, you don't want that to happen right close to the ground. So many of the pilots would fly the airplane probably a little bit too fast around the base to final curve and wind up fast, getting towards a runway, and that can become a problem for you if you develop that habit pattern on a consistent basis. If you run into really fall weather and a wet runway and windy, you probably don't want to have a whole lot of extra energy in the aircraft as you're in that area. But some of these things, when the pilots, that are flying with that were doing this, I might mention it to them just once, because they've got to feel comfortable with the aircraft, and so I just kind of let it go with that.
What are the challenges of landing on gosh, get my words out. What are the challenges of landing on a wet runway in something like an F-104? Then why is that particularly tricky?
Oh, it's a stop, getting the thing stopped. You know, we on a normal day, if you're down at normal fuel, you're going to be touching down probably around 160 knots. You know, flying final at 180, 175 knots, and if you get the higher winds, you wind up having to bank the aircraft down. You're going to be close to a stall speed if depending upon how much you've got in there. So your landing techniques could change. Some people, if they've got a strong wind coming from the side, would let the airplane cock slightly into the wind, and then just before touchdown, they will kick their nose straight on, and then just drop a wing just before touchdown. And so there were a lot of techniques like that we had learned that we tried to pass on to our students.
Again, must have been tricky to do wet runway landings in Texas.
Well, there wasn't many. There were some times where we had some pretty heavy rain in Phoenix, but it wasn't very often. A more common part was to have a bet on what day, what time of day you could fry an egg on an F-104.
Oh, really? Is that true?
Wing, yeah.
I always thought that was apocryphal. I always thought these sort of stories of frying an egg on an F-104 wing were sort of apocryphal, but that's true.
Matter of fact, the hot weather that presented its own issues. Flew several sorties carrying a dart to allow people to actually shoot at the dart, and if the temperature got too hot, we'd shut off flying because you were basically run out of runway and to take off. It just and so they shut her down. Roll over the departure end barrier with the wheels on the ground, carrying a dart.
So what typically was the time of day when you could fry an egg on the wing?
Well, it was around the 10th of May normally. And
okay.
It was,
In May you could do that?
In May, yeah.
Wow. Okay. I definitely live in the wrong country. So what about we're sort of touching a little bit on your experience of the German pilots, and I know every Air Force wants to say it's got the best pilots and the best training, so this is not a question about that. But obviously the Germans had struggles with the F-104 early on. What were your impressions? And I've heard that attributed to mismanagement of the aeroplane, or not really understanding it, or poor techniques. And again, this isn't about naming and shaming, and it's not about who's best. But what was your understanding of how their experience had been to date when you started working with them, and what do you think, on reflection, was sort of going on there?
I think by the time I started there in 1976, that the history of the crashes and the maintenance procedures and operator error had pretty much passed. So when I was flying with them, the first thing I did when I went into these German fighter squadrons, I said hello to all these people that I had, many of whom I had already known and had flown with that Luke, either in a fighter weapons school or as they were undergraduate pilot training graduates, worked with them then. And so I felt I'm going, I'm home. I'm in, I knew a lot of these people. Well, in any event, I think a lot of those issues have been worked out. I think that the maintenance and the availability of spares and that sort of thing was not an issue at all in the German Air Force that I flew with. And I flew out of 3 different bases in Germany. One in southern Germany, in Memmingen, near just a little bit west of Munich. And then 2 of them were up, one near Cologne in mid-central Germany, a place called Büchel up in the Eifel Mountains. Excellent wine country, by the way. And then a little bit further to the west from that is an air base, Norvenich. And each of these had fighter squadrons. I flew in all of them. And I saw very little difference between the fighter squadrons in Germany. Obviously, the guys are wearing different squadron factors, but beyond that, it was very common. And frankly, for me personally, not that much different than if I was flying an F-105 at McConnell Air Base. I mean, the behaviors, the attitudes, and the people were identical. I mean, we couldn't tell the difference, other than the fact you're looking at their uniform, and some of these guys are talking German.
So this is the next part of your sort of story with the 104, isn't it? So you were, if I remember correctly, again, you were heading up a nuclear operational readiness inspection team going around Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. As part of the Eisenhower administration that put in place a requirement for all of the units that were receiving nuclear weapons to have a team of people that would verify that their loaders were able to load this nuclear weapon, that's the wrong one, properly, and the pilots were able to navigate to their target, that they did their target study properly so that they knew what their target was, what the running heading was, and what the weapon setting was supposed to be for that particular target, and to set it up properly. Well, the Eisenhower administration put all that in place in 1955. And so we were just carrying on exactly the same thing. I was stationed at just a little east of Ramstein Air Base in Germany, just north of the French border, not that far from Luxembourg. And our facility was at a place called Capone Barracks, and it was just outside the city of Kaiserslautern in Germany. And it was from there that we would travel to these various units to do our job. And we had 2 hats. One hat was to be the eyes and ears for headquarters shape in Mons, Belgium, to verify that their units that they had on nuclear work were able to do that job. And that was reporting through the NATO channels. And when we were writing those reports, we were writing in the King's English. We also had a hat on, so I still get confused. I was stationed in Canada, and so they, it's Defense for the Sea, or I asked, and so in any event, we also had another hat on. We were the eyes and ears for headquarters USAFE in Ramstein. And our job there was to pick up ideas that the Europeans were using for training and so on, and bring those back to our US units and say, hey, here's a good idea. And so that was our job. And we were on the road fairly frequently. Going to, we had a base in Holland at a place called Focal, over in eastern Holland, have a place in Belgium at air base not far from the German border called Kleine Rogel, and then the three in Germany that I mentioned, and two in Italy. One, the 154 squadron at right outside, not that far from Milan, Italy. They were flying F-104Gs, and then the F-104S was at Rimini, over on the Adriatic coast, about halfway down from Ravenna. And it was a terrific tourist town, by the way. Great beaches. and so we did a fair amount of travel. Now, the behaviors of the squadrons, it really did not matter very much what country you're in. Obviously the people are different, and but the structure was very much the same, regardless of what country you're in or what you did in what country, that same country. They're basically, it's a fighter squadron with a bunch of fighter pilots hanging around, and so that was my experience.
Can we go back then to, you mentioned it right at the beginning, but it's relevant to this then, just the nuclear role of the aeroplane, and you showed us your model with the B-61, the nuclear bomb on the bottom of it. What was the typical profile then of a nuclear strike in an F-104? Were you going to be going on a one-way mission? Were you going to be going out and dropping something and coming back? What were you, when you were evaluating these guys, what did the mission profile look like for a 104 nuclear strike?
It depended upon the target itself. I wasn't privy to. I actually didn't pay much attention to the actual target that these guys were sitting on. Our duty to go into the fighter squadron, we'd go into the alert facility, and I'd ask the pilot for his combat folder, and then I would ask him to describe to me what the weather is at his target. I would ask him to describe to me what his IP, his initial point is, what the heading is from that IP into the target, how far is it, how much time, and what kind of a maneuver were you planning on delivering this weapon. And what I was doing is looking at the pilot to find out if he actually paid attention to what was in his profile. And almost always they knew exactly what was going on. Then I would go up to the aircraft and make sure that and of course I got a guard right with me, because he ain't gonna let me out there by my own self, and make sure that the weapon is set up the way it's supposed to be, and that the aircraft is cocked, it's ready to go. And that was our job, that was laid down by the Eisenhower administration to verify that these guys were doing. Now, once in a while, I would run into a situation where the pilot was actually not prepared. And when I got into a situation like that, I had a phone call with the wing commander and tell him, hey, Joe Bag of Donuts over here isn't, he's not ready to go, so.
Joe Bag of Donuts, nice. What did it look like? Were you going to, would the guy take off and then he'd be straight on the Doppler? Would it be clock, map, compass type, dead reckoning, navigation? How long would they be flying for? Would it be a high type thing? Do you remember really what the profiles might look like?
Yeah, the ones that I saw were all low level. They take off, and they had specific on their map, they had a specific headings, specific storm points, times to be able to maneuver the aircraft around. I don't remember if the ones that I'm thinking about. I think most of those guys will be able to deliver the weapon to come back home, or head off to an alternative site. But if you're actually in a nuclear weapon, nuclear war, the likelihood of your home patch being there when you get back is who knows, or you're sent off to head off to a alternative base to be able to land there. If there's nukes going off around, it's really a real challenge, and it's really wonderful that this has never happened. The folks sitting over there spend a lot of time keeping these airplanes maintained, and spend a lot of time studying the targets and worrying about weather and thinking about this sort of thing. But fortunately, that never happened.
When you watch films about nuclear war, the president always comes up with some codes and things like that, and the codes get transmitted to whatever. Is it my understanding that those sort of rudimentary nuclear capabilities in those earlier years were, once you took off with that bomb, you could drop it, or were there some interlocks?
No, there was a device that we had to cockpit that you had to go through an authentication process to be able to get to the correct code, so that you could dial up this device to actually arm the weapon. Matter of fact, with our squadron, the 7055th, they had a new version of the B-61 brought into Europe. I personally flew the shape to verify that thing worked.
Really?
It wasn't. It was the shape of a nuclear bomb. Everything about it worked exactly like a nuke would, but there was no warhead.
And so, how
we had to verify that thing actually worked. And we certified that.
How did it work then in terms of line of sight? I mean, if you're low level nowadays, you've got satellites you can transmit messages to, and therefore they can sort of, you've got line of sight pretty much anywhere. But how did line of sight work, and how did you administer? You've got all these separate aeroplanes flying their own routes against their own targets with their own weapons. How did it all get transmitted? How did anyone know who was talking to who, and when they were supposed to be tuning in to get their code or whatever?
Well, that was they had deconfliction. It's not only the Air Force, but there's other folks that were loaded as well with nuclear weapons, and there were deconfliction conferences that took place with specific targets being assigned to specific units,
But would because you could be on the radio all day long, authorizing hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons to be released. Was there no way of? Would your code be the same as someone else's code? So everybody in this squadron has the same code, and they've all only got to listen to one message, rather than.
No, it was all different.
Wow.
If I remember right, everybody had you had your own unique.
Right. So what were the challenges of that mission then? I'm assuming low-level navigation in weather. I know that they lost F-104s flying into the ground in those sorts of conditions. How difficult was it, and what were the challenges?
It's exactly that. To keep yourself from hitting the ground. One of the jobs that we did as a F-104 instructor pilot, chasing these guys. We had in Europe. We had, depending upon your experience, a different amount of weather that you are permitted to fly in. A junior officer that's just beginning would not allowed to fly at in certain weather conditions. When I got there as a instructor pilot and as well as a weapons evaluator, I had what was called a black card. And in other words, I could take off at any weather. It was my personal decision. And, and so I had my own, I basically used the same limit that I would have if I were flying a T-39, which I was co-located with in Europe. I flew all over Europe in a T-39 as a pilot. And, so if it was 100 feet overcast and 1 mile visibility or right at that, I'd go. Yeah. And the squadron commanders always put the most junior officer as, to fly with at that. And that's a much lower than he was permitted to fly with on his own, and much poorer weather than he was allowed to fly with on his own. And we'd take off, he'd take off, and I'd be right on his wing and fly low level. And he's looking at the radar returning his map, and he's guiding himself maybe in the clouds at 500 feet, and he's running around about 480, 500 knots. And I'm flying with him, looking at my own radar and paying attention to where he is so I don't hit him. And to be able to check on how well he's doing on his navigation, where he's on course, making his turns on time and all that stuff. That was my job, was to verify that man was able to fly that route in poor weather. And so we go all the way around over it and get up to the gunnery range, and he'd pull the nose up and drop his practice bomb off, and the range tower would call out the hit, where, his range score. And I jot that down, and I drop down, and I note the time that the bomb went off. And so this was all part of the grading criteria. Turn around, come back, and land, and in very, very poor weather. And I don't think I ever failed anybody on their navigation ability. Not there. I did at McConnell, but that's a different story. And F-105. Yeah, but so anyway, that's being able to navigate low level, high speed, in and around clouds, not only clouds but mountains. That is the challenge. Of course, dropping a nuke bomb. Well, there's a challenge.
Can we deal with those one at a time then? So, in terms of the challenge of navigating in low level weather, you've already said that you use the radar to help. You find your way. You've got a Doppler system that, with an arrow presumably on the ADI, that points in the direction of where you've got to go. What do you see on that radar scope then? I suppose most people who have not done it before, including myself, imagine that you get a nice clean picture out of the radar which shows you where the end of a river is, so if you wanted to sort of flow down that river and sort of fly between valleys or whatever you could do, or in a valley between hills you could do. What does it actually look like then when you're using the radar to navigate at low level? Is there a lot of interpretation required? Is it very obvious?
No, it wasn't. In many cases, it wasn't very obvious at all. That was a learned technique, being able to learn how to read the radar and to realize what it is that you're looking at. And it's almost like learning a whole other language on its own, right? Because the radar display is not like, well, now they have really great radars where you got a terrific return, but in those, good definition and all that stuff. That wasn't the case in this particular radar in those years. We're talking stuff 40 years ago. It's just
did at any point, I'm not trying to be flippant, but did at any point while you were doing these things, did you reflect on the fact, you're doing well to still be alive? I mean, that sounds, because you're not trusting the very inexperienced guy to not crash you into a hill, but you kind of are trusting the very inexperienced guy to not crash you into a hill while you're double checking his calculations by looking at your own radar and staying visual with him. Did you ever come back from any of those sorties and think, well, how many more times could I do this before I become a statistic?
I never thought about it.
You never thought about that? Wow.
No. I had a squadron commander one time. We were sitting there and watching these guys take off in the rather poor weather. And the squadron commander looked at me and he says, "Denny," he says, "I hope those guys realize they're having fun."
So what about the nuclear delivery profile then? Why was that challenging? What did it look like, first of all, and why was it challenging, secondly?
Well, depending upon the target, we had basically two types of deliveries. One was a radar lead-on, which is just fly right straight over the target. You set up your weapons control panel, and when you got to the point where the machine's ready to release the weapon, you hit the pickle button, and the bomb would release. But you just fly right straight over the target and disappear over the other side. The other was a LAD, which is you pull it up, and the computer would decide after when to drop the bomb, and the bomb would come off. Which I've done this with the shapes, the actual weight of the weapon, and there's no doubt in your mind that thing is gone. It'll give you a good punch. And then you do your breakaway maneuver that's for that particular target to a very specific heading and throttle position, bang, and get your tail onto the target as the weapon goes off, and so that it comes at your rear.
Were you during that pull up then, or pitch up, or whatever you call it, pull up? Are you following needles on the artificial horizon the same way as you would an ILS, so that you've got the right G loading, you've got the right pitch rate, those sorts of things? Or were you just pulling up to a pitch attitude and then? Yeah,
exactly right. And the heading.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't remember any crosshairs or anything like that. It was just strictly on a specific heading and to a specific climb attitude.
Was it realistic then with this shape? I mean, do you remember how far it would fly to the target after you'd released it, and was it realistic that you would actually escape the shockwave or the blast wave of the bomb when it went off?
Well, if the calculations we saw were accurate, it was realistic. Matter of fact, I know that people were using this toss maneuver in North Vietnam to toss a bomb into a SAM site.
Yeah, Ben was going to tell me about that in my second interview with him. He called that out as something he wanted to talk about. So, okay. So from a flying point of view, then a little bit different to the things that you had done up until that point. Was it a satisfying type of flying to do? Was it something you were happy to be doing, or did you want to get back to sort of less evaluation, more sort of operational type stuff?
I enjoyed it very, very much for not only the flying, which was great, being able to fly in Europe with the with our allies over there was probably one of the highlights of my career. And I met some marvelous people there. Matter of fact, some of them are still in touch with to this day, longtime friends. It turns out that one of my very first F-104 students at Luke it turned out to be a fellow that was half Finnish and half Austrian. And so he actually lived in Helsinki for some time. And there was a point in his life as he was growing, the parents were trying to, they're sitting there trying to figure out, because his mother was Finnish, and they're trying to figure out, well, is this fellow going to be Austrian? Is he going to be a Finn, or is he going to be a German? And and it turned out he became a German national and so on. But so it was experiences like that were just absolutely delightful.
As an aviator, then you flew those 4 Century Series fighters, and I think I asked you which is your favorite. I think you said the 104 and the 105 you were fond of. I mean, if you could only go back and fly one of them, which one would it be? Of all the 4, all the airplanes you've ever flown, 238, 237, 239, whatever. Which one would you go back and fly?
Well, I think the only one that can possibly actually fly is a F-104. I don't know that there are any. I know the F-105 will never be in the air again.
No, but hypothetically, forget the constraints of reality. If you were to go to bed and dream tonight,
I guess I'd say the 104. It was the last one. There's times that I dream, and this is the silliest thing you'll ever hear. But there are times I wake up dreaming that I think I can go fly this thing again. There's no way.
Is there no way? Really? Don't you think it will come back to you?
This old tired old fighter pilot going to be able to get out there and do this? That's for 25-year-old kids, not you.
But that's actually, I mean, that is a very good sort of point to ponder, which is, I think I asked one of my previous guests this, who had sort of been out of the flying business for some time. The first thing is then, does it feel like a dream to you? I mean, you've got your flight helmet there, your HG36, and you've got your models on sticks. And when we did the F-105 interview, you had your F-105 and you were wearing your 100 Missions T-shirt, and so you have all these things around you. And I know you gave away all of your Dash 1s and things to a local museum, which is very generous. But does it feel like it happened to somebody else? I mean, do you still feel a connection to? Do you feel a connection to the young man who flew combat in Vietnam? Do you think that's me, or do you think, that was someone else?
That's an interesting. That's an interesting point of view. Every day, in many ways, it does seem like a dream, but it's kind of like a river. You can go up to that same river every day, and there's water flowing through. You stick your finger in there, in the river, and you pull your finger out, and you put your finger back in. You didn't stick it in the same river. When you stuck it in that first time, it's down there. Yeah. It's gone, and it can never come back. And so just the process of living life is kind of like that. I can't repeat yesterday. That even I remember it. Got very strong feelings about things that I've done fairly recently, but that's all gone.
There is, though. I mean, there are programs where not particularly relevant to you. For example, PALs, the prisoners of war who came back. Vietnam never really got a Finney flight, and I know at Vance they fly, the T-38s, and guys are invited to come and sandbag and do their Finney flight in T-38. That's pretty cool. Do you seriously think, though, that if you were put into the backseat of an F-104, and there are F-104s flying. You're right. There's a small team, I think, in the US that does it at least, and maybe others, but that you wouldn't quite quickly get it back. What is it that a 25-year-old's got that you in your, let's say, sort of 70s/80s have not got?
Well, for starters, I'm half deaf. And frankly, I used to have really good. I had good reaction time, but as age has taken me, my reaction time is nowhere near what it was, and so the part of one of the key aspects of flying an airplane is developing a feel for the flow field that's flying by at you. So I'm used to driving down the road about 65 miles an hour and so on. But to do that at 200 miles an hour, that's a different story, because the feel of the wheel and the touch on the tires on the pavement and all that stuff is radically different at really high speeds compared to just driving around. And I think the same is true for me. I owned a Mooney for 35 years. And, so I know I can get back into that machine and fly it. But its final approach speed is about 80 as compared to 180. And so
do you think this is such a silly conversation, but you're humoring me, and you've not looked at your watch, so I'm going to keep going. But do you think that the muscle memory would come back? Reactions, fair enough. Eyesight maybe not as good as it used to be. Hearing's not as good. You're probably not going to work that well under G. It's going to be more laborious. But do you think that the muscle memory and the systems knowledge and flipping switches and knowing where to look at what times, ops checks, fuel checks, all that kind of stuff, do you think that would come back quickly?
I think it would, but it would take some fair amount of training and time just to be able to get my mind back into the game again. I think you can retain, make it come back, but it wouldn't be just sitting down and being able to do it right off the bat. I don't see that ever happening. But in many ways, some of this stuff is kind of like learning how to ride a bike. Once you know how to ride a bike, you can get on the bike and go. And in many ways, I think that this is probably true with flying airplanes.
You've mentioned the Mooney. We've obviously skipped ahead to the present day, and we haven't talked about how you ended your Air Force career. But when did you leave, and what did you do when you got out?
The Air Force?
Yeah.
Oh, I retired in San Antonio. I was actually working for a medical officer, Major General, a guy named Fred Doppel. And we had, this is part of the Human Systems Division. It's gone. And Brooks Air Force Base, it's gone. And the units that we had underneath us at that time was the Aero Med Lab here at Wright Pat, the Occupational Safety and Health Lab that dealt with cleaning up the facilities for the Air Force was there. I ran the Air Force Human Resources Lab, which was had a couple of jobs developing advanced simulators, as well as doing studies on people and matching people that for the various jobs that are in the Air Force. We broke out what the job requirements were and then measured attributes of people to match the requirements of that job. So we got the right person in the right job. And so that was part of the Human Resources Lab, but also the Aero Med Lab. The School of Aerospace Medicine was there. And so based on the experiences that I had there, we moved from San Antonio back up into this house that I'm in right now. We actually bought, the bank bought, when I came from Europe here to Wright-Patterson back in 1979. and we're still in our original home. Well, in any event, based on what I did in San Antonio, I was asked to join a company and eventually become the director of engineering of a small company working in this area called pollution prevention. And this is a kind of a aspect of pollution prevention that most people don't realize. If you go at the factory for any kind of a maintenance facility in the Air Force or Army or Navy, they do a lot of maintenance. So you buy an airplane, you buy it once, but you got to maintain that thing all the time. And so every once in a while, they send it off to a depot and they tear it apart and they make all the modifications they have to make to it. They'll maybe strip the paint off and repaint it, take all the grease off and redo it. Well, it was that kind of stuff that what we were looking for, to be able to help allow the Air Force to continue operating, but still abide by the new laws that were just coming out, signed by President Bush 41, and looking at the uses of cadmium, hexavalent chromium, which is a cancer agent, lead, and many other substances. And so we went through the Air Force very diligently looking at all of our maintenance processes and figured out where and how much of this stuff we were using, and then looking for alternatives to replace it. And the very last one that wound up working was actually in the electronic field. And that was because of the laws that were put in place in Europe forbidding the use of tin, lead, copper solder in household electronics, televisions, refrigerators, and so on. And because of the potential causing cancer, and the potential cause for cancer is there. There is no doubt about it. And it's, for instance, with lead, it's not a question of it's going to bother you. It's actually how much have you been exposed to, because that's going to relate directly to the effects of that in your body on you. And so we work diligently. Well, finding an alternative for tin lead solder isn't an easy task. And we wound up testing the industry, actually, Raytheon and all these other companies. We went through well over 500 varieties of alternative solders to be able to meet the standards in Europe for electronics. Well, it turns out they said, well, the Department of Defense and Space are exempt. They don't have to abide by that, which is true. Well, that's nice. But if you go to an electronic company and you're looking for resistors or capacitors, guess what? Those are all lead free.
Yeah.
Because why? Well, they don't just build a resistor only for the military. They use them everywhere. And so, it's prevalent. So we wound up doing a lot of testing of electronic gear. And it turns out if you're working in this new age of micro miniaturization in your electronics, the physical distances that are very, very small inside these electronic components. And one of the behaviors of some of these is you get a spontaneous growth of a neurodendron that goes up and it actually causes a short. And we have documented cases of satellites having been launched. Once that satellite is up there, good luck on going back up there and fix that thing. And so you have to, your design philosophy of how you work around the backups and all that stuff is something you got to really think carefully about. Because if it fails, you're done. That one's done. So
did you? I mean, you obviously went through, tacit blue. I would imagine, sort of there was quite a lot of engineering type stuff in there. And then obviously working in your last role at the Aeromed before you retired. But did you miss flying? I mean, so the engineering aspect might be a challenge, might be interesting, but did you miss flying?
I did. Well, I actually flew. I owned this airplane for many years, and but at this point, do I miss it? Not so much anymore. I've done about everything you can do with an airplane except jump out, and and I don't have any plans on doing that. So and I'm at the stage now where flying is really fun. It's terrific, but there's two cases. A guy walks out to the airplane realizing that this is going to be his last flight. This is it. I'm done. There's another guy walks out to the airplane and he doesn't know that it's his last flight.
but interesting. So which one are you then? Because it could be the guy doesn't know it's his last flight because he kills himself, but it could be he doesn't know it's his last flight because he loses his medical certification or whatever. So which one are you?
No, I just walked away. I said, that's it, I'm done.
Did something happen in flight to make you do that?
No, not at all. I had my Mooney. I sold it here a couple of years ago, but I realized I was taking off flying and just boring holes in the sky. And after a while, I said, I've been doing this for I've been flying since 1961, and I've done this. I can do it again tomorrow, but hey, as almost like that was it. Who sang that song? The Thrill Is Gone.
No idea. But what about your family then? We chatted for about 25 minutes before we hit record. And you mentioned that obviously you have a daughter. I don't know if you have other children, but did anybody else get the bug? Is anyone looking at Granddad Denny and saying, I want to fly fighters like him, or are you the only sort of aviator in the family?
No, I'm not sure I quite understood what you asked, Steve, because of my poor hearing. Sorry. Did
anybody else get the flying bug from you in the family? Did you?
Oh God, no, not in my family. No, not really. Although I have had all my grandkids, both my daughters flew with me, frequently. But flying, unless you're being paid to do it, it gets pretty expensive. And so even though they might have gotten the bug and they said, I'd like to fly, I've heard that from two of my grandsons. They'd like to fly. Once they put pen to pencil, pencil to paper, and they realize that this is expensive and they really can't afford it. And so that's an issue. That's very different than what it was when I first started flying. I could afford it. Work at a gas station, and I, you could do this. Not so much anymore.
One last question, then, Denny, and then and I'll let you go. But was there any particular flight you took, or any particular event that really endures? Any moment in your flying career that you still think about, whether it was because it was a good experience or a bad experience, but is there any one flight that if you could repeat again tomorrow you would do?
As a matter of fact, there is. There's actually a couple. There's more than one, but this particular one is really comes to mind, and I saw this behavior happen very frequently, and that was flying low level out of Phoenix, Arizona, and go get these kids up into flying over the Grand Canyon, and they're flying low level, zipping along, and all of a sudden the ground disappears out from underneath them as they go over this canyon, and invariably they climb.
Really?
Yeah.
Was this in the 104?
This was an F-104. And the other thing I would do with it is get along and the flying wing off of me, get to that point, and just I would roll invert and pull down into the canyon.
Oh, no way.
And roll out, and not down there very far, very long, but just down enough. And, just because, I guess. But seeing these people just, they're flying. I mean, they're going 500 knots, and the ground disappeared out from beneath them, and they begin to slow.
Denny, it's been a real privilege talking to you. Four interviews, many hours of your time, and thank you for sharing all your experiences with us. And if I can get out to, the museum at Wright Pat is the best museum in the world as far as I'm concerned. I've spent 2 days there. It wasn't enough. I could do it 10 times more, and still probably not take in everything that it has to offer. So if I can get out to Wright Pat, I'll come and say hello to you, because it would be lovely to meet you in person. But I think from everybody who's listened, and particularly the Tacit Blue interview, that really has had a fantastic response. So from everybody who's been listening to you, thanks for your time and your generosity.
Well, thank you for the interview, and I'll try to do what I can to help you get a couple more lined up.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Denny.